Greetings and welcome to Real Politik. This is your host, James Tracy. Our guest today is Jason Kissner. Jason Kissner is Associate Professor of Criminology at Fresno State University. He received his undergraduate degree at University of Florida in philosophy, his Juris Doctor at the Cornell University School of Law, and his PhD in criminology at Florida State University. He's a contributor to Global Research and American Thinker, among other websites, and he's got some very interesting pieces that have come out over the past few months on MH17 as well as Ebola. And we're going to look at Ebola today primarily, as well as its relationship to political concerns here in this country. So welcome, Jason.
Great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you on the program, and the articles that you've had up on Global Research, some of these things have gone viral. They've been all over. They've received a great deal of exposure. And I wanted to talk about those and get into the specifics of Ebola because alternative interpretations of this whole phenomenon are few and far between, especially if we look at the mainstream media. And there are a lot of misconceptions that are sort of being propagated in those avenues. So give us an overview of this, again, this whole phenomenon concerning Ebola and why you believe it has certain kinds of fraudulent dimensions.
Right. So when I first began kind of investigating the Ebola phenomenon, I really did so from the standpoint of certain descriptive statistics that have been presented about it. So, for example, it does seem to have involved a far greater number of fatalities than previous outbreaks have. It seems to have spread much more rapidly than previous outbreaks have. And so after doing a little bit of research kind of prodded by those features, I found that it looks like it. There's a New England Journal of Medicine article out there that talks about how the variant of Ebola that we seem to be encountering right now is sufficiently genetically distinct from previous versions that it's been assigned its own subclade. And so I dug around a little bit more and found out that still to date, to the best of my knowledge, we still do not know exactly how this apparently novel variant even arose in West Africa. Many people aren't aware that West Africa countries such as Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, they've never experienced Ebola outbreaks before. So with those sorts of things in mind, I began wondering whether it's possible that that the variants that we're looking at right now, together with the apparent increase in contagiousness, the novel variant and the increased contagiousness, maybe it's airborne. So I did a little bit of investigation there, and it turns out that the Public Health Agency of Canada had a piece on its website, not really a piece, but information on its website, indicating that in their judgment there was a substantial likelihood that human-to-human airborne transmission was possible and maybe even happening. And then a couple of weeks subsequent to when I first looked at that, I noticed that they'd removed it. And so that struck me as very suspicious. And primarily one of the articles that you mentioned that I suppose went viral primarily consisted of a discussion of some of the things that were just mentioned. But since then, I've begun to come around a little bit more to the view that what we may be looking at here, at least right now, is mass-mediated fraud in connection with Ebola, at least with respect to that phenomenon as it appears here in the United States.
Let's go back to, you bring up the point that I think this is really one of the most fascinating aspects of your articles, and something that we are led to not consider or even think about in mainstream outlets, and that is that there have previously been no problems. There's been no previous academics concerning Ebola in West Africa. And this reminds me of the whole AIDS epidemic, in the 1980s, where one was led to believe that this was something that sort of organically came out of Africa, when that was not the case either.
Well, it's possible that there's a human-involved engineering component to this. And if there is, that may help explain its appearance in West Africa. Now, I know a lot of people out there are going to criticize people who are heretical and thinking along those lines by saying, haven't you ever heard of natural evolution, and this was just a chance event, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line to me is that that really isn't very much of an explanation at all. And people who are supposed to sort of know about these things aren't simply stating in a conclusory way that it arose in West Africa as a result of, natural selection and basically random processes. They're speculating that, it may be fruit bats or something that brought it over there. Now, I don't know what the migratory patterns of fruit bats are in Africa, but it does seem to me that this outbreak has certain properties that we've never witnessed before, and the geographical anomaly isn't the only such thing. But so more recently, I've been kind of looking at kind of the probabilities connected with what we've been told about Ebola here in the United States, and it really is kind of astonishing, at least to me, that there really is very little evidence supporting what the mass media is telling us is true about some of these Ebola cases in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you talking, for example, about the very questionable testing procedures that are done?
Yes, that's right. The fact that a positive test is returned on Ebola, or really any other positive test for that matter, is not dispositive at all in terms of whether somebody has the illness, for example. Very, very much depends on the prior probability, which in this case would mean very much depends on exactly what persons such as Nurse Baum and Nurse Vincent, what the true nature of their exposure to Duncan actually was. And of course, unsurprisingly, we've been told very, very little about what the nature of that exposure was. So, a rough analogy would be, if those two nurses were on the moon previously, it wouldn't matter that they got a positive test result because there would have been no basis to assume they could have contracted it. Now, we've been told that there is such a basis, but we haven't been told any of the specifics. We haven't been told exactly what the nature of the contact of either of these two nurses was with Duncan, how extended the contact was on any particular occasion, what the overall duration of the contact was. Mm-hmm. And without that kind of information, we really can't meaningfully evaluate the probability that these two individuals did in fact contract it. And then if you turn to the blood transfusions, actually plasma transfusions from Brantley to 3 people, his matching of blood type for plasma transfusion purposes is statistically, probabilistically very unlikely. I forget what that exact figure was that I computed, but it's something on the order of 1% or even less, depending on what Brantley's blood type is.
Well, something that struck me, just looking at the coverage, the news coverage of this whole Ebola perspective pandemic, is that the media are adamant in reinforcing the notion that it is not airborne. Mm-hmm. And now, how can one explain these nurses having contracted Ebola if it is not airborne, since otherwise the only way that one could contract it would be through bodily fluids?
Right. It's not clear what the mechanism of contraction would be there. And I do think that there's been some ambiguity with respect to exactly what's meant by airborne. So, if there's projectiles, for example, of somebody expectorates or vomits, mm-hmm. And there's contraction that way, clearly that is in a meaningful sense airborne. So I think by aerosolize, what's meant has to do with the size and concentration of particles in a given volume of space, and whether tiny particles in very close proximity, for example, or even further away, could contribute to contagion. Mm-hmm. And I do think that more and more individuals out there are suspecting that Ebola can in fact be airborne contagious. And I certainly wouldn't rule that out. However, I am beginning to lean a little bit more towards the possibility that some of this media representation of suppression of the airborne prospect may, for example, be a feint. It may be a very duplicitous move based partly on the fact that the media is well aware, and government media's hand-in-hand partner, they're well aware that persons are very suspicious of both government and the media, and so they're very aware that in many instances people will come to precisely the opposite conclusion to that which the government through the media is projecting, which is a kind of a circuitous way of suggesting that they're dampening the prospect of airborne may in fact be a way of actually spreading more paranoia about it.
You point out in one of your pieces that Nina Pham and Amber Joy Vinson, even if it were proven that they do not have Ebola, the media would likely continue with the narrative that they do, that would be very tenacious in terms of seeking to further that narrative without going back and correcting it.
Well, I hope listeners will agree that that's a point that's well worth reflecting on, in that, to me, it really generalizes well beyond the Ebola phenomenon. Once one of these narratives has been cemented in place, it's very difficult to dislodge it no matter what subsequent evidence says. And so, as we were discussing a moment ago, right now, there's very, very little evidence, concrete evidence, that Nina Pham does in fact have Ebola, or that Vincent has Ebola. Conceivably, they could have something else. It's possible that they have something else that's conventional, that has some of the similar symptoms, but of course it is even possible that they've got something that mimics the symptoms of Ebola that's perhaps not so conventional. But regardless, there's very little concrete evidence that they've actually got what the mainstream media says they have. And I very much doubt that the mainstream media has really appreciated or understands how important it is, before jumping to conclusions about a positive test result, to actually do some fact-checking and some genuine investigative journalism and find out just how it is that these two nurses, as you were suggesting before, contracted it. And so at this point, what they're really doing, not having done that sort of thing, what they're really doing is gambling. What they're really doing is they're basically placing everything on positive test results. And when we're confronted with enough of these cases, whether it has to do with Ebola or not, for mass shootings or active shootings, very similar by analogy, eventually they're going to be wrong. So you've got an active shooting with reports of multiple shooters. Maybe in an individual case, it's easily attributable to eyewitness error. But if we get enough of these multiple shooter reports and enough active shooting cases, sooner or later, somebody is going to be right. But when the media adverts right away to the narrative that it was a lone gunman, well, once that's in place, the media is not going to go back and correct that. And so the public will have been presented essentially with a fraud that has very little likelihood of being remedied.
That's a very good point, and it's something that is antithetical to good journalism, and yet we've not seen the media go back and revise its reportage of, say, the Tonkin Golf incident, or more recent events like Sandy Hook or the Boston bombing, where there is ample evidence to suggest that these events were much more than how they were presented. They were the nature of them, their dimensions were far different than what was presented, what was represented to the public.
Right, and maybe you'll agree that maybe it's in part indicative of a kind of oligopoly or monopsony kind of a structure in the media, in that they're not really interested, that they know from a competitive standpoint there really isn't very much competition. And so it's much more important to just get out there first with a story that blares across the headlines than it is to substantiate the story with anything approaching a reasonable factual basis.
And the corrections usually run a few days later at the bottom of page 2A, and they're really not played up and discussed to the extent that they perhaps should be. Now, they might be given some airing in one of the, say, Columbia Journalism Review, but other than that, they're really not elaborated on to the extent that once again, they would be in terms of benefiting the public.
Well, and once a major mistake is acknowledged in a prominent way, the already low credibility that most persons ascribe to the mainstream media will essentially be shredded. And so essentially what we have right now, it seems to me, is an economic structure that essentially provides an ideal habitat for fraud and irresponsible journalism, because the priority seems to be, of course, ratings, but together with that, the continued promulgation of an overall master narrative or master set of narratives. Mm-hmm. And so that's much more important than actually investigating and finding out what the facts are. And if the facts turn out to be incorrect in particular cases, you know what, who cares, so long as this narrative continues to get propounded.
And the media are very slow to give certain types of events any meaningful historical context where we could better understand what's actually taking place. Now, there's a recent report out in alternative outlets on a Dr. Cyril Broderick, who's a Liberian scientist, and he has come out and recently blamed the U.S. Department of Defense on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, arguing that this is something that the DoD is experimenting on with human populations. And if we look back at the Tuskegee experiments, at what took place in Guatemala in the late 1940s in terms of inflicting people with syphilis to study the effects, the U.S. government has a long history of using human beings as test subjects.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's sometimes a very little bit of acknowledgement of past abuses by government, by the media. It's almost like a kind of a limited hangout process by the media, in that they'll kind of say, yeah, we messed up before and the government messed up before, but you know what, now everybody's better, everybody's different, we're much better people than the journalists of the past, and politicians are much nicer politicians than the politicians of the past. So what reason do we have to think that U.S. government would be up to similar sorts of things now? And if they were, you can be sure we'd be the first ones to report it.
That was then, and this is now, and everything is better.
Great way to summarize it.
So, on the Ebola affair again, what do we really know about this Thomas Eric Duncan?
You know, that is really the cipher of this whole thing. And my answer to that is, I certainly don't know a great deal about him. I suppose there may be plenty of people who do. And what's become of his family? I mean, the last I heard, I believe they were spirited away to some sort of location, I think in a gated community. What's their status right now? Have they gotten it? And why haven't any of the people who have gone into that Dallas apartment gotten it? Wasn't Judge Clay Jenkins, who's tightly connected to DHS, I believe, wasn't he one of the people who went in to the Duncan apartment without protective gear? I'm not certain about that, but yes, this Duncan fellow, it is kind of mysterious. I really don't know who he is, actually.
What struck me as really odd is in a news report earlier this week, and we're speaking on Sunday, the 19th of October. The reporter was going to Thomas Eric Duncan's family to find out more about who his medical providers were, about who the medical personnel that were servicing him were, and there were some 75 or so individuals, which first of all seems rather unrealistic, but why would they go to this family, the family of Thomas Eric Duncan, to get this information? Isn't this something the hospital should have, or the medical group that is providing services?
Well, isn't that extremely unusual? And there's another record-keeping piece of strangeness, if you will, connected to this hospital, which is that evidently the hospital sent 14,000 pages of medical records about the Duncan case to the Associated Press. And the Associated Press reported in an article that CDC did not have it. So I'm sort of wondering, AP did not indicate in that article that they had sent it to the CDC, and the CDC ignored it. They simply said that that they didn't think that the Centers for Disease Control had the 14,000 pages of Duncan records. But then alongside in this AP article, alongside the discussion of the 14,000 pages of medical records that for some unknown reason the CDC apparently wasn't interested in, the hospital was still trying to ascertain exactly who Duncan's carekeepers were. And so that may have something to do with why it was felt necessary to contact Duncan's relatives to find that out.
Yeah, and once again, if the relatives, the family members are concerned about the welfare of Duncan, why would they be paying attention to or keeping track of who the medical personnel were? Whenever I have a loved one in the hospital, I'm really not taking down the specifics regarding who the nursing staff are and so forth. It's not really the first thing on my mind.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I think then it may just be a situation where there's no other real alternative, because maybe for some reason Texas Presbyterian didn't think it necessary to keep adequate records, even though they generated 14,000 pages of information on it, we're told.
We're coming up on our first break in a couple minutes, Jason Kissner. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, you brought up in a more recent piece that you did that appeared on Global Research. You referenced an article on Zero Hedge about the clipboard man who appears along with the medical personnel in hazmat outfits who were assisting one of the nurses who was aiding Thomas Eric Duncan, who purportedly also contracted Ebola.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's utterly bizarre, and he's got on the federal uniform with the dark navy slacks and the pale blue shirt, which smacks of executive branch. And so he's sort of traipsing behind one of these Ebola victims.
Is this at an airport?
I believe it's on the runway.
Yeah.
And they're about to put the patient on the I believe it's a Phoenix Air plane. And Phoenix Air, incidentally, I believe is based in Cartersville, Georgia, which is pretty close to the Centers of Disease Control. And there's been some talk out there that Phoenix Air does indeed have CIA connections.
Mm-hmm. It could be a front.
A CIA air carrier. And so this federal clipboard figure carrying the clipboard, toting his clipboard in hand, he's got no protective gear on whatsoever.
Well, that's the craziest thing about it.
Right, and he's in very close proximity, and people may say, well, but he wasn't, actually standing right next to her at any point in time, and she did happen to have hazmat gear on. Okay, well, so then why were all the other people surrounding her wearing hazmat gear, and are we completely certain as to how this is transmitted? And he does follow her onto the plane afterwards. So it is extremely bizarre, and actually, it would seem to me that actually here we've got an instance of a federal official acting completely on his own in utter disregard of all regulatory considerations. Because it's simply really not possible to believe that he would be allowed next to her without hazmat gear on, whether he decided of his own volition to wear it or not. I mean, given the national security implications, I would think that very tight regulatory considerations would essentially compel him to don protective gear, regardless of what his desires were. And that gear would already have been ordered. It wouldn't have taken him a very long time to put it on. And so there's really no reason whatsoever for him not to have been wearing it. Regardless of whether his risk of contracting it under the conditions was low, the cost of his contracting it, if he did, would be so high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we know the origin of those photographs?
That's a very good question. And I probably should have looked at the conditions under which that photograph was taken. So, for example, was it kind of taken by somebody who wasn't supposed to be taking it? Why was that photograph even taken in the first place? But as to who took it, I don't know.
It looked like it might have been from an airport observation deck, perhaps. So just by someone who was there at the airport. Do we know what airport it was?
Don't quote me on this, please, but I think that they were leaving Dallas.
Okay.
But I'm not for I believe Maryland, but I'm not sure about that.
All right, so that could very well have been something whereby someone just snapped a few shots with their iPhone or the equivalent and put it online.
Wouldn't it be interesting if that were so?
Indeed it would. This is James Tracy. You're listening to Real Politik here on Truth Frequency Radio. We're speaking to Professor Jason Kissner. He's Associate Professor of Criminology at Fresno State University. We're talking about Ebola. He's written a number of great pieces appearing at globalresearch.ca. The most recent one went up on October 19th, Fraud and Manufactured Ebola Paranoia in the United States. We'll have more with Professor Kissner in one moment, coming back to talk about Ebola, the potential role of the Obama administration in that, and much more right after this. Please stay tuned. Greetings, this is James Tracy. Welcome back. We're here on TruthFrequencyRadio.com, the Real Politik program, speaking to Jason Kissner, who's Associate Professor of Criminology at Fresno State University, and we're talking about Ebola. One of the things that I came across recently, Jason, John Rappaport has written quite a bit about this, and he has recently observed that the whole Ebola spectacle, if you will, could very well be a maneuver toward enforcement of a global medical pharmacological regime.
Oh, I wouldn't discount that prospect at all. I wouldn't be surprised if in coming weeks we hear growing calls for mass vaccination programs, and certainly the Ebola situation has been a windfall for certain companies such as Techmira and MAP Pharmaceuticals. Definitely a great deal of funding is getting poured, great deal of capital is getting poured into this fight against Ebola that wasn't, being poured in before.
That's one thing that I was going to bring up. There's this experimental vaccine called ZMapp that you have actually brought up in some of your work, and yet we know so little about MAP Pharmaceuticals. Its manufacturer just seemed to have popped up out of nowhere, this company.
Well, MAP Pharmaceuticals has ties to the U.S. Department of Defense. They've also got ties to the Canadian government. And that ZMapp thing, that too, perhaps I should have mentioned at the very outset, that ZMapp really was a strong precipitant for my initial interest in this Ebola phenomenon, because you had a couple of reports on ABC and CNN where you had a flabbergasted Dr. Sanjay Gupta and a better medical mouthpiece for the establishment I cannot think of, where he's basically just shocked that Brantley comes back to the U.S., supposedly after this long trip where he's been very ill with Ebola, and he's walking under his own power into the facility at Emory, which, again, at the time they said was a great facility to bring folks to, but so why is it then that it really matters what other hospitals these Ebola patients show up in? But never mind. So on the ZMapp thing, it was said on ABC and CNN that within 20 minutes to an hour after having been administered ZMapp, Brantley his symptoms began reversing. And I just found that claim to be so ludicrous that it really, really did raise my antennae on this.
And yet, if you look at some of the tests, the studies that are used, that the FDA considers to approve vaccines and drugs, they are so thin. This would not really surprise me a great deal, especially in a time of alleged panic where we must have a vaccine.
Well, it's conceivable that it works, but it seems to me that they don't have a big enough sample to conclude that it does. And if it does, I'd be very surprised if it's kind of like this magic pill where as soon as you take it, your grave illness dissipates instantaneously. It's almost as though they needed his illness to dissipate, or a reason for his illness to dissipate instantaneously so that they could film him walking under his own power into the Emory facility.
What are the prospects that this Ebola virus is being used in some way, shape, or form for the purposes of biological warfare or limited biological warfare to perhaps influence a broader geopolitical policies of the United States and the Obama administration specifically?
Well, the government would certainly have license to do that insofar as it's virtually impossible that the mainstream media would ever call them out on it, even if they did get direct evidence that that was what was being done, which incidentally is a fantastic reason for having installed Obama. I mean, Obama and the mainstream media have been in a 6-year love affair. There have been some tiny bumps in the road, but essentially Obama is immune to all forms of criticism. And so if you were up to something nefarious in terms of foreign policy, he'd be a great selection to do a kind of a warfare kind of a policy in a slightly less overt way. He's also a great Wall Street president, and anybody who's paying any attention at all to markets realizes that.
It's in the vein of Woodrow Wilson.
Yes, right. We have a proud tradition in the United States of Wall Street presidents, don't we?
That's right.
But in the final analysis, it seems to me that there is a foreign policy component to this, whether it really is biological warfare or whether it's something more along the lines of potential biological warfare coupled with a mass-mediated fraud. I'm not entirely sure, but whichever of those two it is, it seems to me true that Obama is being heavily pressured by this. I mean, conceivably, this Ebola situation could terminate his presidency. I mean that literally. I mean, it could literally lead to something like a resignation, or it could lead to such intense pressure on the office that Obama is basically rendered wholly ineffective for the rest of his term if he doesn't handle this correctly.
What you've suggested in one of your articles is that this is something that the Ebola event, spectacle, phenomenon, is something that may not be a threat, and yet it could become one. It could be operationalized. Right. It could become a real event if the Obama administration does not capitulate in certain quarters.
Right, and that's what makes this potentially so sinister and yet so effective, because they've really got him over a barrel on this, if this in fact is what's going on. And of course I'm not 100% on it, I just think it a reasonable possibility.
Sure.
If that is what is going on, the problem that Obama faces is he can't exactly go out to the general public and say this whole thing is fraudulent, because then he'll be ridiculed out of office. And then he cannot entirely operate under the assumption that it's entirely fraudulent means that it will be in the future either, because it's so easy for them to eventually just slip in a real case. And then everything that has gone on before that, essentially for practical purposes, gets converted into real, whether it was or not, because the effect will be cumulative.
Assuming that it is real, and that if what this Liberian doctor Cyril Broderick is saying is in fact the case, that the U.S. DOD is doing experimentation on West African populations. You also point out in one of your pieces that there have been several genetic alterations of Ebola since the outbreak began in December of 2013. By the way, this whole thing's been going on for almost a year now, and yet it's reached a fever pitch in the U.S. news media because of a couple possible cases. But if there are these genetic alterations of this Ebola, again, there's been no epidemic in West Africa, up until late 2013, if I'm not mistaken. But any sort of vaccine is just like the flu vaccine. There are so many mutations of the virus, it's not going to be effective anyway. That correct?
Well, that may well be true. That's something that I'd be less confident in asserting without knowing more about the virological properties. So I would just agree with you that as a general matter, we know that viruses can mutate very rapidly. And it is interesting that the mainstream media doesn't seem to be very interested in talking about the genetic properties and the mutative, if that's a word, the mutative properties of the virus. And they don't really have an excuse not to at this point, because so much else that they're talking about in connection with it does function to spread fear. So if they're going to spread fear, what is it that is stopping them from talking about the novel genetic properties of these strains?
Yeah. Well, the media and the government, you refer to it as the media-government axis in one of your pieces, and I think that's very apt. There are so many ways, so many methods they have in terms of creating fear in the public, because that way we're much more easily led. Whether it's weapons of mass destruction or, mass shootings or serial killers, or now we have Ebola. All of these are used, I think, for the purposes of political control. They're puffed up to be more than what they actually are. And in some cases, perhaps we could do a separate show on this. The whole, the case of mass shootings, of serial killers, all of these things have dimensions that are very questionable in and of themselves. If we look at the CIA's project MKUltra and other types of other similar sorts of projects, Artichoke and what have you. With that in mind, you've also done a good deal of work looking into the background of Obama. I happened to see the original Manchurian Candidate last week. I'd seen it once, probably 20 or so years ago, but again, and there are so many things in that film that are, very, very much worth considering given our present situation. And with that in mind, we know so little about Barack Obama. And again, you've delved into this, and you've kind of endured the label of a birther, and by the way, the progressive left has really been very effective in terms of quelling any sort of inquiry concerning Obama's background with that sort of label, that pejorative, and yet it is something that is worthy of consideration.
Well, we know everything we need to know about Obama, don't we? He's the smartest person who's ever walked the face of the planet. He's the best president the United States has ever had, and so on and so forth. Well, aside from being flip, yes, his background is a complete mystery. And, it's a complete mystery, I think, when we think about how much has been buried and how important what has been buried is. I think it's a very high likelihood that Obama is an intelligence product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a very economical explanation for why his background is so murky, and how, in spite of his murky background, he had this literally, it's probably a hackneyed phrase, but he really did have a meteoric rise to power. I mean, almost literally out of nowhere.
Right.
This guy comes to the presidency. And since the presidency is at most 8 years, the intelligence agencies, I think, are going to do everything they can to prevent someone who they don't want getting elected from getting elected. Because if you got a president who comes in for 4 years or 8 years, that can undo all of the long-term plans that these agencies have had in place. I mean, in principle, those plans could be undone. So they need to have a handle on whoever it is gets elected.
Well, this is something that Leon Panetta has remarked on, that he said that the Central Intelligence Agency has no problem whatsoever as long as Obama continues as president, because he's not going to object to any sorts of policies of the military intelligence complex.
Right, and I think part of the reason for that is that Obama likes his job. I think at heart he's a Marxist, and I think he has done a lot of things that are Marxist in orientation in terms of it. Stanley Kurtz has a really good book on that called Spreading the Wealth, where Obama is essentially doing certain things with respect to suburbia, that subsidized housing and things like that could be construed as Marxist. But then again, there's also his fascist element when you look at what he's done with the police state and when you look at what he's done in terms of pumping up Wall Street. Mm-hmm. So those sorts of considerations, I think, lead one to the conclusion that there's a decent likelihood that he's an intelligence product. And if you go back to the election in 2008, So he's running against Hillary Clinton in primary season. And Obama, I believe, had just won a number of primaries and was really beginning to build a great deal of momentum. And then of a sudden, on the campaign trail, he drops that he'd been to Pakistan as a college student. And it was the first time during the season that he'd mentioned it. And that was in spite of the fact that Pakistan in '08 was a very live foreign policy issue. And it's interesting that he only mentioned it 2 weeks subsequent to his passport having been breached by a corporation, Analysis Corporation is the name, that was headed up by one John Brennan.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't surprise me if there was information on Obama's passport indicating information about Obama's time in Pakistan, and that maybe he was there for longer or conceivably at a different time than he's admitted publicly.
And of course, John Brennan became Obama's national security advisor, and among other things, orchestrates drone hits.
That's right. So Obama's got pronounced contacts with the national security apparatus, certainly up to his being elected. And then when you look at his background at Columbia,
mm-hmm.
you find that one of his semesters at Columbia is a complete and total blank. There is no evidence whatsoever that he was even there that entire semester. And so that contrasts a little bit with evidence about other semesters at Columbia. So he's supposed to have been at Columbia for 4 semesters. And if you look at 3 of his 3 biographies about him, you can find at least perfunctory evidence that he was there. So you'll see photographs, you'll see street addresses and phone number. You'll find assertions that he took a class or 2 with a couple of different classmates. But you can find nothing presented by way of evidence with respect to his spring 1982 semester. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was in Pakistan during that time.
Well, you've obtained your law degree from Cornell, which is an Ivy League school. And what strikes me as rather unusual is that Obama went to an Ivy League law school as well, Harvard, and was the editor of the law review there, and yet he's never authored an article, has he?
You know what? I think there's one tiny little piece. I think it had something to do with torts, and it wasn't really a law review article proper. It was just a couple of pages. He's said to have been mentored by Lawrence Tribe while he was at Harvard Law School. But other than that, the only piece of writing that is said to have had, or that has Obama's name on it, that we can have reason to believe actually was written by him, it was a piece that he did supposedly as an undergraduate at Columbia that appeared in a Columbia University publication called The Sundial. And it's actually about nuclear deterrence. And if you read the original article, it's just astounding how terrible the writing is. I mean, the grammar is absolutely atrocious. So I kind of wonder exactly how it is he even got into Harvard Law School.
Well, that's a good question, but is it common to become the editor of such a prestigious outlet without having some record of publication yourself? Because if
right.
You know,
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, typically, the law review is a very competitive process, and in many institutions, it's decided primarily on grades. So I don't even know if Obama was elected to the law review first and then subsequent to that, or wrote onto the law review and then was president of law review after that. But I believe I've read some things indicating that the way he got to be law review president was that there was an affirmative action consideration there, and that he actually became president not because of any academic accomplishments, because there aren't any that we're aware of, like you're suggesting, but simply because he was voted into that position.
Mm-hmm. And he also allegedly wrote 2 full-length books, and yet we're really uncertain about what the origins of those are. For example,
Jack Cashel over at American Thinker has done a couple of really good pieces making the case that Bill Ayers actually wrote each of those books. And Ayers has been rather coy about it. He's been caught a couple of times, and he's far from assertively denied that he's the one who penned those biographies. And I think partly that's because Ayers is actually not entirely thrilled with certain things that Obama has been doing on a foreign policy front.
He's actually jested in public that he wrote at least Dreams from My Father.
Yes, he has, and that combined with what I think is a pretty penetrating analysis by Jack Cashel has left me persuaded that Obama didn't write those biographies. And plus, like you're suggesting, what's his scholarly record of accomplishment, actually? It's just another mainstream media manufactured fraud as far as whatever scholarly background he's said to have had is. He's published next to nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It appears as if much of the media are really more concerned with affirming the accomplishment of an African American having ascended to such a high public office and not being critical. And I think that that's something that plagues our broader political environment as well. There's a reluctance to be critical of Obama regardless. I think one could make the argument that as far as the environment goes, he's been a failure. If you look at what's taken place in the Gulf, what's taken place with regard to Fukushima, if you look at the geopolitical situation, it's a similar sort of catastrophe. And yet there's no real attempt to critique him along those lines in a very substantive way.
Well, one could make an argument there that the neocons essentially wrested the presidency away with the Kennedy assassination, and the presidency has been neocon ever since. Now, many people on the right will get extremely frustrated with any attempt to characterize Obama as a neocon, but I just think that that label fits in many ways. Now, there are others in which he is not, but I think in the most important respects, that's exactly what he is. He's certainly a neocon in terms of how Wall Street is treated. He didn't get rid of Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chair, when he could have. He got re-upped. Now he's got basically Bernanke too with Janet Yellen. So in terms of Wall Street, he's a neocon. The only way, arguably, he deviates in a major sense from neoconism, if you will, is in terms of how he's conducted foreign policy. But even there, like you mentioned, he's done these drone strikes. He's militarily involved in 6 or 7 nations. But I would say that if he has drawn a red line in the sand, he's drawn it in terms of things like boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria. I think that he's not neocon enough to go that far, which might be part of the reason why we've got this Ebola fraud, if it is in fact a fraud. I think that these neocons are ready for business, so to speak. And I think they're looking right now for very aggressive intervention in the Middle East and against Russia.
So they're seeking to perhaps push the envelope with this Ebola event.
Yes, that's how I see it. That they feel like Obama was installed with their blessing, that he was supposed to be essentially somebody who would do their bidding, and that he's proven too refractory. As aggressive as he's been already in terms of foreign policy, it's just not enough. And by the way, these Secret Service White House fence jumping situations, these situations are statistically unprecedented in terms of their timing. You had one of those jumpers on 9/11, and that got very little coverage in the news media actually at the time, especially in terms of, as best as I can tell, nobody in the Western MSM even ID'd the name of that 9/11 fence jumper. You have to go to RT to find out that the fellow's name was Jeffrey Grossman. Mm-hmm. And then you had another jumper on I think it was 18 or 19. I think there was one on 9/26. You had, at 9/16, at the Center of Disease Control, you had somebody, a felon, get on an elevator with a firearm next to Obama. All of these things clustered so tightly in time, nothing like it has ever happened in United States history. So, and that was right around the time that we first heard about the Khorasan group, whoever they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I think that was more messaging to Obama that he needed to be more aggressive.
Well, If Obama is something of a fraud, I think one could make the argument that he is if you look at his background and what have you, and the Ebola affair is somehow contrived as well. You point out in one of your recent pieces that mass frauds are not very difficult to perpetrate on the public to begin with, at least the U.S. public.
Mass frauds, I think, are a lot easier to perpetrate on the public than many people believe. There's always this talk, oh, well, somebody will say something and so on, which I actually think is a pretty weak argument. And sometimes people say, well, too many people need to coordinate this for this to work successfully. I actually don't think that's true. All you need is a small group of people to generate something that they know will be very newsworthy, that they know will generate a great deal of fear and or excitement. Then it gets planted in the mainstream media. They're not going to question it. They're not going to do any investigative journalism. And before you know it, it's contagious.
Right.
And so at that point, it basically goes viral of its own. It gets its own momentum, if you will. And thinking in terms of a kind of a construct to sort of capture some of the processes may be going on, I've sort of come up with this idea of knowing acquiescence. And so that may be something like where when you're structurally incentivized to perpetuate material that you know is fictitious, you may well be aware that it's fictitious, but you acquiesce and you promulgate it anyway, precisely because you're institutionally incentivized to do so. And there's very little disincentive because very little meaningful investigative journalism is ever done, and there's very little genuine competition in the news industry. And furthermore, once that narrative gets out there and once enough people have been activated by it, so to speak, you're subject to a great deal of ridicule for raising any questions. And so this idea of knowing acquiescence perhaps might function as at least a somewhat useful way of capturing the kind of contagion that accompanies or that can easily accompany mass fraud events.
On that note, Dr. Michael Jason Kissner, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on Real Politik.
Oh, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Okay, take care.